and welcome to the latest edition of What Does the Giraffe Say with me, Kathleen Mortorno. We're an organisation that aims to connect people with conservation efforts around the world by holding interviews on social media. Today, I am very happy. I am joined by Dr. Greg Rasmussen, and he is the founder of Painted Dogs Research Trust, which is based in Zimbabwe. So, Greg, if I could just hand over to you, you could tell us a little bit about yourself, your passion for wild dogs, painted dogs, and how the organisation began life.
Well, I suppose conservation is something that was with me all my life as a kid. You know, at school, grew up in Zimbabwe, by the way, and at school there was absolutely no interest in conservation. I'm talking a hell of a long time ago now. And there was, arts, it was only sports, and wildlife conservation didn't exist. And in those days, I was passionate about snakes. And what was fascinating was that I never really I spent all my childhood in the Natural History Museum, just learning and being fascinated. And painted dogs never even entered my mind as that's something I was going to be doing. I mean, it's crazy, you'd think. And I actually went and joined the British Merchant Navy, and then I went back to Zimbabwe, and I went to the Natural History Museum again for one of my mentor, as I call him, Dr. Broadley. He's passed away now, but he was a world authority on reptiles, and I was helping him voluntarily for three years on snakes, doing field trips. And on one particular field trip, the curator of ornithology came in and said, Greg, you want to go to the field? We're doing a field trip tomorrow, Hwange National Park, for 3 or 4 weeks. I said, brilliant. When? He said, we're leaving at 5 tomorrow morning. I said, brilliant. I'll be ready. It was now 4 o'clock in the evening. Well, I don't care. You say field work to me and field trip, I'm there. And basically, the simpler the better. Field trips to me are not something where you take your gin and your tonic and your this and your that. It's very simple. And so I was on this field trip, but with ornithologists as a herpetologist, and actually I realized that we were working it was like I was on the wrong ship, and I couldn't find any time to collect reptiles, and they'd say bird party. So I sat on the front of this Land Rover, and at one point, this was the defining moment for me, crazily. At one point, they stopped the Land Rover. Now, I just assumed they'd stopped the museum vehicle because they'd seen a reptile, because I'm one-track mind. And I couldn't see it. So I jump off the vehicle. I'm on this bush track that's just the width of the, dirt track, the width of the Land Rover. And I'm saying to the curator, where's this lizard? But you've got to look on the ground. It's no good looking behind. Otherwise, the thing moves and you've lost it. And he shouted, get in the car. And then I said, where's the lizard? He said, get in the car. And then the third time he said, Greg, get in the car, lions. And they'd stopped to look at lions. And there was a pride of lions on the side of the road. And this idiot was wandering around the road looking for a lizard that didn't even exist. Anyway, so after 3 weeks, I got back to the museum, and then I left on my own field trip that I'd set up. And somebody came into the museum, a guy called Dr. Josh Ginsberg, and he said, I desperately need someone who's got field experience to run the dog project I've just started. This was 1987. And they said, well, field experience is hard to come by. And this is part of the journey, actually, is that for young biologists, field experience, they can get all the education you like in university, but getting that field experience is so tough. And it's defining into being a good biologist. And they said, well, there's Greg, but, he works with snakes. Anyway, he contacted me and said, would you help me with the Hwange Wild Dog Project? And I said, well, actually, I said, someone's informed you completely wrong. I said, I work with reptiles. I don't work with painted dogs, wild dogs, as they were called then. And he said, well, help me for 6 months. He said, just for 6 months, and then I can find a replacement. He said, I desperately need someone to... I said, fine, I'll do it. Anyway, so I finally get into the field, and I see my first painted dog. I mean, he just basically, Josh had got a collar, and he said, Greg, I've got to go back to the States, but thank you for coming up. He said, there's a dog, it's on a collar, I've got to go tomorrow, the day after, whatever, goodbye. And so I saw the dogs, and I started to follow them, and I would start to follow them up to 28 days. And very early on, there were two things that were working in the same direction. The first thing was that as I was driving around Hwange National Park, I had Hwange wild dog research written on the side of my truck. And these Australians would come up to me, and I love Australians. And no, this is not a punch at Australians, because I really do. But, you know, they pull no punches, and that's probably why I like them. You know, and they give as good as they get, which is another good thing. You know, there's no beating about the bush most of the time with Australians. And they're also good at pulling your tail, and they're happy if you pull it back. So anyway, they say, "Good day, mate. Are you doing feral dog control?" Well, I thought they were pulling my tail, you know, like I was some dog control officer going around shooting rabid wild dogs. And it turns out that in Australia, wild dog is the official term for like a feral dog. And that's what there's actually a definition. And I suddenly realized, you know what? This name needs to change. Because that's what and then you talk to marketers and they'd say, this is ridiculous, you know. You can't call it a wild dog. Everyone will think it's some feral dog with rabies and mange and this and that and the other. And of course, it's not. But then the thing was that I started to follow the painted dogs. And I had my first defining moment, I think, was when I was following the pack. And all I knew about dogs in those days, because if I read everything written about dogs, they were these savage, ruthless, aggressive killers that would do, take animals down alive and torture them. And, you know, people are good with their stories. And one of my defining moments was one dog got mauled by a lion. I was right there. I heard the mauling going on. By the time I got there, the lion had disappeared. The dog was lying on the ground. And I walk up to the dog, and his name was Olna. He couldn't even lift his head. You know, and he got that glazed look in his eyes, and I'm like, you're done. You know, I don't know. I mean, and the lion had grabbed it around the throat and given it a damn good shaking. I suspected maybe even his neck was broken. I mean, it's possible. So I think, what can I do? I mean, there was a vet nearby. I managed to get hold of him, and the vet just by a radio link, and the vet said, look, it's nature, Greg, leave it. I haven't got time to come, and it's nature. And I always question that statement anyway, because what is nature anymore? We've messed around with absolutely everything. And so I left the dog. I came back and took the vet's advice and came back the next morning. The dog was gone. There were drag marks. And I assumed he was died in the night and was dragged away by hyenas. Then I continued to follow the pack that had been 11 and was now 10 in my mind. And there was a dog in the pack called Circus. If I ever write a book, Circus is going to occupy a whole chapter, you know, at least. I could write a book about Circus, I suspect. The Circus was Olna's brother, and both of them were about 14 months old. And Circus kept disappearing. And I kept going, where's Circus? He didn't have the collar, so I couldn't see where he was going. But at the end of the hunt in the morning, he'd disappear somewhere. All right, then I think he was out of sight. Then one day I'm like, no, something's going on here. What is Circus up to? I had to know. And I got a tracker, and the tracker and I, because when you foot track, you track in teams. One morning, the tracker and I, we took off. And we got to a point about 5 miles away, following Circus. It was a long 2-hour hike. And we get there, and there was Olna under a tree, alive. And Circus had been looking after him for months. And I'm like, that's it. Yeah, I was done. I was toast. And it, you know, that was the first defining moment, was that I realized that, you know, nothing written about the dogs was true. You know, this was a whole new. Here was a case of a species looking after its sick and it's weak and it's old. You know, and we now find out that wasn't a one-off event. And then the other, you know, there's the one side of it, and then the other side of it was that the ranchers were shooting the dogs badly, and you know, and I had a pack of 24 that lasted 5 minutes, and it was reduced to 20. 20 were shot. And I realized that here was a species that nobody liked. Not even the tourist public liked painted dogs in those days. You know, their minds had been bought by all the, you know, the stories, the books about dogs. Even you know, the you know, the guide to mammals of southern Africa. You know, some biologists are writing absolute horrible stuff. And so I realized, and in fact, at one meeting I was out, there was an ecologist from Parks, and he said, "What are you doing advocating these painted dogs?" He said, "They're horrible, vile things." He said, "I was an ecologist in Hwange." I'm thinking, if you're supposed to be an ecologist, you're supposed to like nature, you know, well, in all the good, the bad, and the ugly, you know, not just the things that you like. And he said, "I can tell you," he said, you talk about them looking after their sick. I can tell you that they, on a kill sometimes, they cannibalize each other." I said, "How do you get to that conclusion?" He said, "I've got proof." And I said, "What was the proof?" And he said, "Well, I got to a kill where clearly the dogs had made a kill and there was a dog carcass." I said, "So where's the proof?" He said, "Well, the dogs were there and the carcass was there." I said, "Did you look for lion prints or hyena prints?" "No," he said, "because it was the dogs." And this was the kind of attitude that we were up against. And then so it was really, as much as anything, I suppose there's always been a bit of a Robin Hood in me. You know, and you know, these dogs I felt the dogs needed a champion. Somebody had to be their voice, because my mother always used to say nature doesn't have a voice. And I thought, well, you know, this is something I felt I had the skill sets to do. You know, I grew up in Zimbabwean farmland, so I had some understanding of the people I was dealing with. And that, I suppose, is where the passion came from. It was like suddenly I had a job. I was a job with a job. Up to then, everything I did was just kind of interesting, you know, but this was a mission. I was on a mission. And that mission, you know, that was meant to be for 6 months, 33 years and a bit later, I'm still on my mission, and I'm not going to, you know, and that's it, you know. So that's the background of painted dogs. And the more I learned, I mean, the one thing that's so great about painted dog, but it's actually about any species, you know, you could study slugs and they're fascinating once you get into the detail. And I mean it, you know. Somebody sent me a link I said, "What's this assassin bug? What's this bug?" And he says, "Assassin bug." And when he gave me the life history of it, I was like, wow, this is fascinating, you know. This little red and black thing, it's amazing what it gets up to, you know. It's the devil's in the detail. And so I used to, and decidedly, tenaciously work with the ranchers. And it took years. But conservation does take years. You know, nothing, you know, we can't, there's not a press of a light switch. Any solution that's taken so long to create takes double the time to uncreate. And so it was we used to do radio broadcasts, because radio was the medium, and I would do one once a month, where it was actually all recorded in one day. The guy would come out and then he would do a whole year's recording. For 3 days later, he'd have a year's worth of recordings, and he'd go back, and then he'd come back and he'd say, "This is Wildlife Forum. It's January, and the birds are out, and the lakes are there, and this is that, and I'm with again end of January with Greg Rasmussen." I wasn't doctor then, and then I would slowly share, and the one thing I would always share, I made a mission when I started. And I think this is important, is I am so sick of fake news and rubbish that people dig up and dredge up, you know. You know, and I decided that I was only ever going to say what was the truth. What I knew was true. I knew painted dogs were killed by ranchers. I knew they looked after their sick and their weak. I knew they didn't do surplus killing, rarely, you know, they weren't kill a kudu, big kudu, when they're only going to eat, you know, five kilos of meat and walk away. And the other thing, of course, is, well, the more you get to know the dogs, and their social system and the way they look after each other. I mean, it's astounding. You know, the effort they put into their pups. You know, and they have this. It really is okay. It's the Three Musketeers, one for all and all for one. But the fact that the babies feed first, and every dog has a job, you know, and then their organisation is just so great. We could learn. So I learned a lot from painted dogs. And I like to hope that I model some of my teamwork on how painted dogs operate. I mean, for example, every morning every dog greets each other. Well, hey, it doesn't hurt. Good morning, everybody, but not just hi, everybody, you know. Really physically, good morning, Fred, Martha, Joe, you know. And the reason they do that, we suspect, is that it stops conflict, because they're the only species we know doesn't have conflict. But the likelihood is, if I'm really nice to someone most of the time, and when I mess up, which one does, the likelihood is I'm going to be forgiven quite quickly, or it just blows over before it becomes a hailstorm. And so yeah, I mean, we could talk about the dogs and they're carrying their sick, and they're incredibly smart. And the more we're like any species, you know, it's like the amazing Frans de Waal and his work, Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? In his latest book, one of his latest books, I don't know if he's popped another one out. But, you know, they've got a huge cranial capacity, which is bigger than a wolf. They have a language that is exceptional, which we're still a long way off unraveling, painted dog language. It's, you know, the chitters and the twitters and the who calls, because they have a who call, which is a long distance I'm lost call, which is a and they blow it on the ground. They don't. You always imagine that they're like a wolf going woo. No, they blow it on the ground for some reason, and they bounce it off. And the only thing that we do know, in fact, because I had one of my early students who used to spend like 28 days in the field with me, Simone Hartwig, and she said, I want to do a PhD on dogs. What can I do? And I said, well, why don't you study the who call? And the reason I was particularly set on understanding that who call was that because I tried it with a big boombox and a speaker like an ice cream van. I got this huge speaker that was enormous on the top of my roof rack. And I'd be driving around with going, woo, 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 like I was trying to sell ice cream. And I never had any takers because I was hoping to put collars on, you see, and get the dogs to come out. And they don't respond to calls. And in fact, one day I played the who call right in front of a pack, and they just lifted their ears and went, oh, okay, back to sleep. And I'm like, okay, something's going on about this call. Why aren't they reacting to what is technically a distress call? Well, Simone said, are you sure a whole PhD on a who call? I said, well, I'm sure we can find something else as we go. But I said, make that your focus. Here's the devil in the detail. The who call starts off with a woo, woo, woo. And then at the end, it sounds like they've run out of breath. Woo. And it was like, just like you've run out of breath, like a singer couldn't play the last note, you see. And when she analysed the spectrograms, every dog at that last ooh was his name. It was an identity string, which they could interpret and say, Greg is missing. Now, the reason then it didn't work for me, that unless there was a pack member missing, they weren't going to respond. They just said, well, that's not my pack. It's not the painted dog Greg pack. It's somebody else's. So I don't care because they're not fiercely territorial. And if I was playing their call and they're all lying there going, who's that idiot playing that call? Because, you know, the dog you've just played is right beside me, snugged up to me and feeling very happy. Thank you very much. So I don't know what that noise is, but it's not you missing. And, you know, as the years have gone by, you know, the dogs just never, ever cease to amaze me in just about everything that they do. And so, yes, you.
You're clearly like incredibly passionate about these animals, and you've said before that this is kind of your life's mission. Now, I know when I was doing some background research on you, that actually your mission and your love for these animals actually helped to kind of save your life in a way. Can you tell us a little bit about this story and what happened there?
Well, it's actually the question's a little bit of a double-edged sword, because had I not been studying paint, you see, in order to study painted dogs, they have this enormous territory, and it's huge, and so the only way in those days was to try and find them sometime when you couldn't find them for love nor money, was to get up in a plane. Well, pilots were great and they would help, but eventually, I managed to get just enough money to buy a test plane, which wasn't even like a regular Super Cub or a Piper Cub. I mean, the plane I was flying, to be truthful, was a flying brick, but it was all I could afford. They wasn't working on government's money. Most of it was my parents' money and anyone else in those days. So I have this my ultralight, a fixed wing, and in fact, I wasn't even flying for painted dogs. I was flying for rhino, because the national parks had a serious spate of rhino poaching, and they said, Greg, can you try and help find some of our... And I used to take off from runways like as soon as you could see the runway, because then in those days, at that time, normally there isn't much wind. And I took off from a new area that I'd never flown in before, which was higher, and I missed this. You miss one beat when you're flying, you're asking for trouble. And unfortunately, the list of dead biological pilots is way beyond anything else. I mean, the likelihood most don't survive. And I took off for the Rhino at about 5 a.m. Told everyone, look, I've got enough fuel until about 11 o'clock, because I used to have a tank that I could siphon back into the back. It was all very makeshift. And so I took off. I find the Rhino, and what I wasn't expecting was that there was an airflow in Hwange that comes from the east, but normally that was higher than my circling height, much higher. And it must have moved down, because that morning I was circling to find the Rhino, and I got caught in what's known as a wing stall, and you just go round in a spiral. And ended up smashed into the ground at like 5:15, 5:20 in the morning. And well, the first thing I was afraid of was fire, because fuel was dripping down. Amazingly, what adrenaline does, because I didn't know what was damaged then at that point. All I knew was that I had to try and get away from the plane. And I used I threw myself out in terror out of the plane. I started to move away, and I'm like, no, hold on a minute. And managed to pull myself back close enough, because I said, I've got to call Mayday. No surprises. This is serious. I tried to call Mayday, but the battery of all the radio communications are smashed in the impact. The battery is short-circuited on the radio, so positive to negative. That'll kill a piece of machinery quicker than nothing. And so it turns out that the long and the short of it was that I had broken every bone below my waist. Basically, my pelvis was broken, my femurs were broken, my tibs and fibs were broken, the bones in my feet were broken, my ankles were broken, my ribs were cracked, but that we can't do anything about cracked ribs. And so during that whole thing, I mean, it was a long, obviously, what was 24 to 36 hours, 36 hours, seemed like an eternity, of course. And so, I was suffering from loss of blood internally. I was suffering from dehydration. I was suffering from, well, of course you will if you've broken all that and you've thrown yourself from the sky from 1,000 feet. It's supposed to have parachutes when you go skydiving. And I got to a point where, in that period, when apart from, yes, I had to deal with hyenas, and you can see it on I Shouldn't Be Alive, the Discovery Channel. I had hyenas to encounter, but because I understood biology, that was my biggest saving grace, was that I understood as a biologist what the heck my body was doing. Like I was going to run into oxygen issues, and I was going to run into dehydration issues, and you name it. And I knew what was going on internally. Had I not known what was going on internally, I wouldn't have been able to make the right decisions. And so a lot of my challenges were dehydration, because I had no water. I mean, you don't take at least 5 liters of water when you're going up in the plane for an hour or two. You know, it's extra weight in a plane that can hardly carry anything anyway. And so I had to manage all those things. And in fact, the dehydration I managed by covering my face with my hand and trying to recycle my breathing. But that took concentration. That took a lot. But there was a point in that, you're talking about it saved my life, because I did, you know, on the second day, I was very close to death. I was dehydrated, and I was disheartened by obviously hearing spotter planes, but they couldn't find me for love nor money. And it was that again was trying to keep my chipper up. And there was a point during that whole event, which again we could talk about this whole thing for about 2 or 3 hours, but I got to a point where I'm like, I'm done. You know, I've fought to beat this, and I've given it my best shot. And you know, there was a point of time where the pain was so much bad when I said, you know what, I thought to myself, well, do I want to die? You know, do I? You know, things can be easy sometimes, and I almost at that point the understanding was, you know, when they talk about, going through my head was when they talk about, you know, Aborigines just say, I'm going to die. I've done my life, and I'm just going to turn the mental switch off. And they go, and they just, seemingly, if it's true, they just go and say, I'm going to die, and they die peacefully in their own. And I thought about it, and then a kick came in that was so powerful, and it was like, and I thought about, you know, you think about, well, what have I done? I always used to say I'd never want to be hit by a car and die from a bloody car crash. If I'm going to go, you know, and there was and I thought, well, you know, I've done so much for the dogs so far. I mean, I've been going a while. I've done a lot for the dogs, and I thought, well, you know, I can say I've achieved. And then the turning point was like, and I was thinking back, and then I thought, you know what, but there's so much more I want to do to save painted dogs. And that was my adrenaline that got me over the last couple of hours until they actually found me, and started, you know, sticking saline in me and God knows what. And in fact, and okay, it was a long recovery. And in fact, one thing for sure is that what people don't realize is that, you know, the documentary is very powerful, but the most powerful thing of the whole lot is the 4 years that went after that. Yeah, the actual recovery, you know, disappears for a lot of people into, and there's so much to help other people that have got into that position. They look at themselves and say, this Humpty Dumpty's never going to walk again. You're never going to have a life again. But, you know, there's powerful messages in the recovery story, not just the dig me out of the dirt story.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating story, and as you quite rightly said, it almost needs its own show. But I recommend people to go and check it out. You can see it on, I think it's on YouTube as well. One of the things as well, what I love about your passion and what your organisation does is it's one of your missions as well to inspire young Africans to be the next generation of conservation biologists. Can you talk to us a little bit about this and why that's so important to you?
Yeah, absolutely. The you know, the whole thing is that first of all, Africans must manage Africa, right? Europeans must manage Europe. You know, people in the US must have some autonomy. But importantly, is that, we do not have as many. The challenges for wildlife conservation are enormous. We all know that, right? And we need an army to deal with it. We need bright minds coming from all directions to help solve all our problems, whether they be global or local. And as I said earlier in the program, one of the thing is that I realize is that nobody ever gets field experience. Nobody ever gets that mentoring. That I was lucky. I had a mentor when I was a kid. And I realize now the importance of mentoring, and I got to do field work. And I thought, well, I mustn't be just me. So my mission is to get students into the real world of conservation biology, get them passionate about being in the field. You get them all wagging their tails when I say we're going to do a field trip. And field trips today are no different to field trips then. They're as simple as they can get. They're a bedroll, simple ration, simple food, nothing, no frills, no furbelows, because the frills and the furbelows is being in the bush. And they get to bond with it. And often it's amazing. One of my students, she said, it's amazing how after such a short period of time with Greg in the bush, a simple piece of dirt feels like home. And that's one of my missions. But also the really important to me is to bring as many women into conservation as possible and start balancing up the numbers if we can. And the reason I say that is not, well, there are 2 or 3 reasons. One is my mother was denied an education by her own mother because, oh no, you become a wife and a hairdresser, don't you? Or no nurse or a secretary, and then you make a very good wife. And my mother said, well, she made a very good mother and wife, but not the way society wanted it, way she wanted it, thankfully. But the other one is I really believe, well, it's a fact as far as I'm concerned, is that we all have different sexes have different skill sets, right? And conservation needs every man and his dog, every skill set, every mind. You can't solve problems by saying, this is the way, right? Other people solve problems differently. Men and women solve problems differently, and we need all those problem solvers in the fray and look at things from a different angle, because it doesn't, and that to me, so to me, my mission is to get young Zimbabweans, and the more local, the better. I mean, in fact, we're very excited at the moment because I started a program some years ago mentoring young school leavers after finishing their O-levels and then finding funding for them to do A-level and then A-level to university. And then encouraging them, inspiring them to be whatever gets them excited. It doesn't have to be painted dogs, just whatever their natural bent is. And I've got a young lady now just about to finish her bachelor's degree, and she's going to be the first woman ever in this whole community to go to university and do a science degree. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's brilliant. But she will do masters and she will do a PhD, and I've got a whole gaggle of gals out there all doing masters and PhDs, and I'm proud of them. I've got some guys as well. I'm not taking a one track in mind, but seriously, it's important that we empower our students and teach them, unless they get out into the field and look at it, like really look at it, they don't learn to think about what is an ecosystem. You don't understand the bigger picture if you just read a textbook. So to me, I'm as passionate about my young students and getting them to me tomorrow, to be tomorrow's biologists, because I'm not going to be here forever. I may hit a bus tomorrow. No, that'll be very miserable if that happens. I'll tell them to lie on my epitaph and say no, he died when he was fighting a lion or something. Don't say I was hit by a bus. And it's so important. It's critical that we and so it all starts with me, the education. We start with kids. We have young school children, and bringing them up into what program I call Kids for Science, where they really, and I don't dumb down to them, because when I was a kid with this professor, he didn't say, "Oh, that's a wormy thing." He'd give me the scientific name. We really feed them the knowledge, and it's amazing how they love it. They're empowered by language. When we're dealing with painted dogs, the one word that comes up a lot is kleptoparasitism, which is loss of prey by theft. Well, I could say painted dogs have their food stolen by lions. I could say painted dogs are kleptoparasitized, and the kids go, "What's that?" And I say, "All say it," and then give them the definition, and they're empowered. They never forget it. They never forget it. They don't. They absolutely they embrace it, which is so exciting. And so the teachers have to watch out, because sometimes the kids try to throw a googly at them, saying, "Do you know what a kleptoparasite is?" And of course the teacher hasn't got a sodding clue, but that's his fault, not mine. I always say to the teachers, when you come to when the kids come, listen very carefully. Don't just sit playing on your Facebook or looking at your phone, doing something. Yeah. So anyway, so that's, and my whole thing is to get as many of these students as what I call really good, thoughtful conservation biologists that base things on fact, because that is what my mission has always been, is that science must find the facts or the direction things are going, and then conservation action must be developed on those facts. Now, sometimes it's tough, actually. You produce the facts, right? And then no one wants to listen because they all know better. They haven't studied anything. It's a bit like all this, what's going on in the world with COVID. Everyone's a virologist, for goodness sake. Everyone understands how vaccines work. Not one, we can guarantee that 0.0001% person writes the word vaccine hasn't got a clue what's inside the bottle, or even how it was formed, or even anything about it. But they can talk very, very, very eruditely about it, And so the facts must drive. Now, sometimes it's hard getting those facts out. I mean, for example, going back to my early days when I was working with the ranchers. Yeah, the ranchers would say to me, I'm like, "Why are you killing the dogs?" "Oh, it's they're killing our cattle." And I'm like, "Really?" I said, "Okay." I said, "Well, I need to study that." "No, I'm telling you they're killing my cows, You don't need to study it. I've got the facts." And I'm like, "Yeah, wait a minute, you do have an ulterior motive." And it turned out because they hated the dogs because their grandfathers hated the dogs and their great-grandfathers hated the dogs. And all the Europeans, because most of them were Europeans traditionally have hated wolves and wolf-like creatures. Yeah, that's what happened to the poor wolf in Europe. There's this kind of, almost like a racism against a species rather than a race of people. We target a species, because wolves are work of the devil. And I was accused of being the work of the devil as well in some of the farming. So we had a prejudice issue as well, no surprises. And so finally I produced the facts. And the facts were that painted dogs killed 1.7% of the farmers' losses were attributed to painted dogs. And I said, that's the facts. And the facts are that 50% of your losses are your bad management. Cattle swallowing plastic bags and baler twine killed 10 times more stock and cattle rustling was another one. And I came up with the facts. Then the farmers said, "But we don't like painted dogs." I said, "Well, you should have said that in the first place." But what happened was that the facts actually switched around the public. The public then, who were supporting the farmers and their stance, with these wildlife forum programs, they came together, and the public then started to say, well, actually, the ranchers are prejudiced. And so we got those facts. I always remember being very excited because I got the facts. The farmers used to have their magazine called the Farmers Weekly, monthly, and once a month this magazine would come out in its plastic bag, and to them this was like their Bible or Playboy or something, and they always had a center spread, which was like the stock feed of the day or the story of the month or the biggest Brahman bull that was ever weighed in or something, and I managed to coerce the editor to let me have the center spread to show the whole dog story. It was almost like blasphemy. I couldn't believe it happened, but it did. And the editor said, "No, fine, Greg, you can have the center spread." He said, "You can have the full double page." And but then also, it was also about a social contract with those ranchers, because they'd said to me, "The dogs are killing cows," and I'd said, "Maybe they're not." And I stayed in the farmland, and I followed the dogs intensively on foot. And I suppose quite often my tenacity got me a lot of respect, the fact that I just don't give up. It's amazing how in the end that can win the day. I don't know why, but it does. And they had started to get some respect for me, even the fact that I'd sleep out in the bush for like a week, because they wouldn't do it. And the fact that I loved it, I love sleeping in the sand, and it's comfy stuff. You can just wiggle your bum and it's like, and shake yourself down and make the perfect bed. And but I had said to them, and this is a very important lesson in any negotiations, is that historically conservation has been a very much a us and them situation. I want you to stop doing what you're doing. And you say, well, what are you going to do? There has to be two sides. So in this particular case, I said, I want to study the dogs for 3 years. And I want to get the figures on how many cattle those dogs are killing. But you have got to stop persecuting them in that 3 years. Because if you shoot all my dogs, how can I study them? I mean, I took a very pragmatic approach. I could almost had to choke when I said, yeah, you just shoot the dogs. It's fine. Of course, I would want to shout and scream, but I couldn't, because that wasn't the way to play the game. And finally they said, okay, but they said, what if they start killing cattle? I said, well, then we still go. I said, but I promise I will move those dogs. Now, I knew other dogs would fill the space. I said, but I promise I will move. I'm doing something from my side. You do something from your side. The end result was that the dog stayed there for the full 3 years. When I made that promise, I hadn't even got a clue how to catch a pack of dogs. I was like, oh, how do I? So I spent 3 years literally practicing various cunning plans that were a bit like Wile E. Coyote in the Roadrunner, because I was always a step behind, and how to catch the dogs, and the dogs spent their life doing this to me, until finally I sort of mastered it. Got what I'd call tame packs, because the packs in the farmland were very different animals, and that was something I learned, in the same way that when you read about the wolf slaughter in the States and how the trappers were trying to catch the last wolves, and there were just some real hardcore wolves out there that were just a step ahead, and they were not going to get caught. These dogs in the farmland were exactly that. They were like the SAS versus the average troopy, soldier. They really were. I mean, they were something else. I mean, they ran me ragged. And in fact, they ran me and the tracker ragged, and I kept firing trackers because I figured they didn't know what they were looking at sometimes. Until one of the trackers succinctly said, you know what, Greg? He said, we've got a problem. And I thought he was going to say we've run out of food or something, because that's the sort of problems we always used to encounter. And he said, these dogs, he said, they're as clever as a leopard. I said, so? He said, there's 12 of them and they're working as a team. And he was right. He was absolutely on the nose. And sure enough, we picked up the pack with great difficulty 3 and a bit years later, got them, moved them some 400 miles. 3 escaped on the first day and went all the way back 400 miles. And they were moved to an area where they'd never been before. So, it was like, whoa, how do you know? How do you do this? What's going on? There's a recent thing going on Facebook somewhere about a wolf that was translocated to Isle Royal and got off the island on an iceberg, island on an iceberg back to the mainland and hightailed it thousands of kilometers all the way back to wherever. Now, she wasn't taken by that route. She would have been flown in there. So how do they know? Anyway, so that's the beauty of the natural world that never ceases. You can study something all your life, and only the arrogant will say, I know everything about painted dogs.
I mean, you kind of touched on it a bit earlier when we were talking earlier on, but with your organisation, if people are watching back home and they want to be able to support, is there anything that they can do back home to help you guys during these, especially during COVID times?
Well, there's lots of things a lot of people can do, and they just don't realise it. I mean, obviously, we all know we need funding. Absolutely, yes, we need funding. And there are web links. And in the States, there's a very good web link, wildnet.org/PDRT, that makes sure that we get 100% of the money. There's no 2% here and 2% there. But the other thing is, I mean, for example, at the moment, I need someone who knows how to rebuild our website. It needs a complete rebuild. Now, if someone is web savvy, tech people have got so much to offer us. Because we're not tech people. Tech people who could say, a guy put his free time in to build our current website, but he said, Greg, I'm busy now. I can't. He said, I know it needs a shakedown, but I haven't got the time. It needs almost like a rebuild with the modern platforms, etc., etc., etc. So there are a number of things that people can do that actually don't cost money, right? I mean, with COVID, yes, we're really battling, because normally this time of year I would be out in the States doing my dog and pony show and enjoying myself, drinking beer with very good friends, which is great, and raising money at the same time. How good can life get? And and of course it's with this COVID, I think we're all feeling a bit lonely, really. I mean, one of the things every time I go fundraising to the States in particular is you suddenly realize that you're among a body of people that care as much as you. They just want to help in whatever way they can. I mean, we've got a lot of tech things we want to do. I mean, if somebody wanted to run a webinar to teach all my students how to do Excel and Word properly, that doesn't take money. That takes skills. People have got skills that we don't have. Tour operators, tour companies, when they finally get back coming again, there is one that, tour operator can say, everyone flying to Vic Falls can leave a little package of something that the project needs. Not a suitcase full. Well, you can do that as well, but we're always desperate. We welcome people to join us who've got skill sets that we need, because we don't have them all. And even if we did have them all, there's always other ideas. We have volunteers that come. Some raise their own money to come. Sometimes their organization, if it's a zoo, sponsors them to come. Or, and, they come with a different set of skill sets to help us, whether maybe they're educators. So there are many ways people can support conservation. It doesn't only have to be money from your own pocket, or if you don't have money in your own pocket, go and empty someone else's. Do fundraisers for us. I don't have any money, but I know a man that does.
I think you've hit the nail on the head as well. A lot of time people think it is just all about the money, but actually people providing their time and their skills is something that can make a big difference.
Oh yeah, I mean, if someone wanted to set funding appeals up, I haven't got the time to be doing that. I'm trying to at the moment, I'm spending all my time on this road traffic thing. Because traffic and cars are slaughtering animals throughout Africa, throughout the world. And, where you've got highways that people are allowed to go on through national parks, the damage is extraordinary. And again, this is how can people support conservation? If you see an appeal out there, don't allow a highway through the Serengeti National Park, do whatever you can in your capacity, right? You may be just someone who can just sign the thing. You may be someone who's got a little bit of a legal backing, right? Who can say, well, we can help. Because conservation is a team. It's not just biologists. People who can help us with social media. And it goes. The list is endless.
I completely agree. So I'm mindful that we're running a bit out of time now, so I'm going to start wrapping things up. But is there anything that you want to finish with?
Only that we're on our major challenge at the moment is the road traffic campaign. And in fact, in one of the questions you asked me, what was probably the greatest thing I've ever achieved? That there are many successes. There are many things that where you just go, oh my God, I get that amazing moment. And one of the things, it's like conservation can be very disheartening sometimes, particularly when it seems like you're being buried and you can't see the light, and it can be quite gloomy when all your study animals are being killed by ranchers, for example, in the early days. But bearing in mind, I started in 1987, and by 2002, the last painted dog was shot in Zimbabwe, and there's been no painted dog shot in Zimbabwe since that date. That was a milestone. But that's conservation. That was 15 years of damn hard work to get one outcome. And it's the only country that I know in the world where a predator, where shooting is absolutely blanket stopped. And but now I've got one, and then when you get something like that, you almost take it out. People say, how do you manage when it always seems so bleak? You hear about all the animals that get, and I say I take things like that as my candle, and that's my torch until the next one comes along. And at the moment, our biggest challenge, and it may actually be a bigger challenge, I suspect, which is sad, is dealing with this road traffic situation that is slaughtering painted dogs. And on this one last year, for the last 5 years, one road has systematically wiped out every pack that tries to use that road, even briefly. It's supposed to have an 80-kilometer-an-hour speed limit. No one gives an SH1T, And and it's one thing dealing with ranchers, and I honestly believe that it's probably going to be a bigger challenge for me to make people slow down when they see wildlife than it is to stop a redneck rancher shooting a painted dog. And that's sad. That is really, really sad. In an area where this is the livelihood of everyone here in Victoria Falls area, northwest Zimbabwe, is tourism, is wildlife utilization. And those people that are making the bread and butter are still driving like petrol heads. Anyway, so, and again, we're working on trying to develop technology that will help the police and parks monitor that road more efficiently, but not, contacting a company that says, oh, we do it in Australia. If you've got a budget of $200,000, we'll give you anything you want, because they're just using taxpayers' money and they don't care a damn. We've got to develop systems that we can hand out not just for our own little area. Good conservation often comes up with one species devolved for one problem for one species. A solution comes. So we're now looking at trying to develop technical solutions that are affordable, that we could hand out in national parks and say you need one man at the beginning, one man at the end, and when that driver comes in a bit early, you were speeding.
Yeah.
And make it simple. And that's where we need the people with technical expertise. There's someone who got COVID time, to wrestle, and they're not easy problems. They're big problems. But most of these things are really solvable. But all it takes is a continuous, how do I solve this problem?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Greg. I've absolutely loved having you on the show. It's been fascinating, and I hope everyone's enjoyed it as much as I have. If you're watching back home and you wanted to put a question to Greg, then please do pop it in the comments section, and I'll be able to share it with him afterwards. Meanwhile, as Greg said, please do keep supporting. If you like, comment, share, all the social media that we're doing, more people can become aware of the work that people are doing all around the world. So thank you so much for watching, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.